Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. When you think about aviation, you might think about an elbow-to-elbow flight down to Florida for your last vacation, or maybe an equally crowded flight to Chicago or New York for a business trip. Maybe visions of long lines waiting barefoot for a TSA personnel to give you the once-over before they pronounce you acceptable. Well, for some of us, aviation brings to mind an altogether different picture, one that gets filed under F for fun. When I was a sophomore in high school, I woke up one Saturday morning and on a whim I decided I would take a $5 introductory flight in a Cessna 150. I wanted to see if I would get airsick. Well, I didn't get airsick and I was hooked. I worked a full-time job that summer and spent most of my money taking flying lessons. Flash forward some 40 years, and between working in helicopters and flying airplanes, I've got about 10,000 hours in the air, a commercial license, an instrument rating, and a picture of aviation that sees the business side, the fun side, and well, just about every other side you can think of. No matter what your vision of aviation might be, I think it's safe to assume that very few people in this country realize just how much aviation influences every one of our lives every day. And welcome to the show, Norm.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
The pilot community in Western New York is a relatively small but tight-knit community. There's probably maybe 300 or 400 aircraft in the area at the various airports right in the Buffalo area. So it's a small community. A lot of the people out there watching now really don't know too much about general aviation, the small aircraft that we fly. You get a lot of questions from pilots and non-pilots every day. What's the most common misconception that you can think of?
I think the most common misconception is that you have to be special, you have to be rich, you have to be super smart, whatever the case might be, to be a pilot. And the fact of the matter is, it's not all just doctors or lawyers or exceptionally wealthy people, but it's people that hold everyday jobs, and they may work in retail, they may be mechanics, they may do any kind of things, and they simply have an interest in aviation, pursued it, and realized it was an achievable goal.
You know, I get that question too, you know, isn't it really expensive to fly? And I kind of, long time ago, I came up with a comparison. If you're a skier or if you're a boater, maybe even a golfer, I mean, you spend a lot of money on those pastimes. It's really, in a way, comparable to a lot of other hobbies that you might have. Very
much. And I've heard all the same things and said similar things, that if you're a member of a golf course, if you are an owner of a boat, and you have maintenance and storage and slip fees and whatever, you're not looking at anything really very different. It's simply a matter of where you choose to put your interest and what you choose to pursue. Look at the people that might own a particular American name brand motorcycle. Mm-hmm. That again, you're looking at a sizable investment there.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. When I was just out of college a couple of years, I had a roommate down in Hamburg, and you know, he had a good job, and he decided he was going to buy a new car. And he bought an Oldsmobile at the time, and it cost him, you know, X number of dollars. And I thought to myself, well, you know what, I deserve a car. I was driving a junker at the time, you know, an old car that was falling apart. And I looked into it, and I realized that for the exact same amount of money that he spent on his new car, I could get a used airplane. And I ended up saying, well, let's see, a car over here or an airplane over there. I'm going to get an airplane. And that's how I got involved in aircraft ownership.
There is a big misconception that a lot of people think that, you know, if you want to have an airplane, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase the airplane and then go from there, where in reality, as you said, a used aircraft can easily be purchased well in the same price range as a good quality used car or an SUV, and provides all kinds of different opportunities.
Yeah. And actually, I sold that airplane a few years later for more than I bought it for.
Not uncommon.
You know, and then I moved up to a better airplane, and I sold that for more than I bought it for. And so gradually I worked my way up to a much more sophisticated airplane. It didn't cost me all that much more in the end.
Unfortunately, at this point in time, there aren't that many aircraft new being produced, and therefore the quality stock, if you will, of used aircraft is actually appreciating in value. So what you're describing is a very possible story for people to pursue.
Well, for people out there who, and I know there are a lot of people that have talked to me about, you know, I've always wanted to take flying lessons, but I really either didn't have the time or I didn't know how to go about finding an instructor or a school. How do you go about exploring
Well, it's a pretty simple process. Most significant sized airports have flight schools. You can look them up easily online, go to the local airport and see a sign that says learn to fly here. What I recommend is try a couple of different schools. The $5 introductory flight that you took, those are long gone. It's going to cost a little bit more than that today. But usually in the $7,500 price range, most schools have some introductory lesson programs. You'll get a little bit of ground training. You'll get a little bit of time getting ready to get into the airplane, understanding the pre-flight and so on. And you'll probably get somewhere between half an hour to an hour in the air. During that time, you'll be flying the airplane. Your instructor will be next to you, instructing you, telling you how to do things. But you'll get a feel for it. The reason I always suggest trying 1 or 2 or even 3 different schools is an airplane is a very close place. You're going to be right next to whoever it is. Number one, you're going to want to like that person. And number two, more importantly, you're going to have to get a feel for the way they teach and make sure that that lines up well with the way that you learn. Different instructors have different approaches and different students learn different ways. You want to make sure you get a good fit.
Now, for young people out there, or people who have kids or grandkids that are, 16 or 17 years old and might be interested in aviation as a career, this is probably a sweet spot when it comes to learning.
There has never been a better time for a youth interested in an aviation career. We are looking at an upcoming shortage of pilots, which some people are getting very nervous about. But the reality is that's an opportunity. The opportunity for youth today to get involved in aviation. Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, my organization, is working right now on several fronts. We've created a fully approved 4-year STEM program, which we're rolling out and making available to area high schools, where we will get kids interested in aviation and start them on one of 3 different career paths, either aircraft pilot, drone pilot, or aeronautical engineer. We're not wanting to wait until they have gray hair to get them interested. Unfortunately, the number of pilots that we see so often is looking more and more like you and me. But working with high school students, getting them involved. Scouting has programs that get kids interested and involved in aviation. A lot of different aircraft organizations have summer camps and other experiences that kids can start to learn and go from there.
Yeah, as you say, it's kind of cyclical. When I was coming of age, the Vietnam War was winding down and a lot of pilots from the military were getting into the airline industry. So it wasn't a great time for a civilian pilot, such as myself, to look into that as a career because there was a lot of competition. And the military, was highly trained and they were preferred by the airlines. Today, it's just the opposite because there's not a lot of military pilots exiting, and there's a lot of those pilots that are retiring, the military pilots that came in 30 years ago or 25 years ago, and they're getting to retirement age.
Yeah, there is a mandatory retirement age of 65 with commercial pilots, and so those in our age group that came out of the Vietnam era and so on, they are approaching or going into retirement at this point in time. So a lot of things are happening though. Programs to bring students into aviation, I already mentioned AOPA. The regional airlines and the major airlines are now creating programs. It used to be when you got into the regional airlines, the pay was not very good, and you entered and you started building time, but most of the time regional pilots had to have a second job until they took the next step. Today, the regional airlines and the major airlines both are creating training programs to bring in people that show a good aptitude towards piloting, but may not already be pilots, and training them and getting them experienced and getting them ready to command today's airliners.
And if you're looking for a career that pays well, when you become an airline captain, you know, with enough experience, you're going to be making good money, a couple $100,000 a year for a very experienced captain is not unusual.
A very experienced pilot or first officer certainly are going to be making into the six figures, but even at the more entry levels, pilots coming into the regionals now are receiving signing bonuses, and they are in demand, and when a job is in demand, the rates are going up. You're starting to see starting wages, probably $50,000, $60,000 a year, and then it goes up from there. The airlines are all about seniority. So the longer you've been there, the more choice you get as to what assignments you get, where you want to go. I know commercial pilots that they work about a week a year, or excuse me, a week a month, and then they're off for 2 weeks, and then they work another week. They might pick up an airplane in Alaska, fly to China, fly from there to Australia, fly from there to Europe, and then come back to the United States, and that's all a week's work. And then they're off for 2 weeks because they have a certain number of hours that they hit within the month.
Well, it certainly is an interesting job with interesting benefits, unusual. When we come back, that's all for this segment. When we come back, we're going to talk about the fun of flying and a couple of the events that are coming up very shortly. We'll be back right after this message. Welcome back to The Big Picture. Today we're talking about aviation, and my guest is Norm Eisler from the AOPA, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. And we were talking about the business of aviation a little bit, airlines, pilots, and now I'd like to get into the fun of aviation a little bit. Unfortunately, right now, the timing of this program is a little bit off because most everybody out there who's interested in aviation, seriously interested, or who is a pilot, is probably on their way to Oshkosh for the nation's largest aviation event of the year.
I leave on Tuesday.
Yeah,
and,
it's happening as we speak, just about, and it's quite an event. I've been there a few times, and it's amazing.
Oshkosh is a magical place. It is a somewhat small town airport. At this point doesn't even have commercial airline service on a regular basis. And once a year for 10 days, it becomes the busiest airport in the world with more departures and landings than Atlanta, than Chicago, or any other place. Over 10,000 aircraft come to the field all at the same week. Some of them are transients, bringing people to see the show. Others are display aircraft. It's a great big garden party of aviation enthusiasts from all over the world, literally, that come to see, talk, and breathe airplanes.
I was based in, for several years out of Van Nuys Airport, which is one of the busiest in the world, and I don't think I'd like to fly into Oshkosh. I'm not sure I would have the nerves.
Flying into Oshkosh is on my bucket list. I've never done it, but one of these days I will do that before I give up flying.
Well, there's several things to see and do in Oshkosh. If you're at all interested in aviation, if you're fascinated by airplanes, whether you're a pilot or not, I mean, it's an experience, and I highly recommend it someday.
Tremendous amount of what we see in today's commercial aircraft and civilian aircraft all started as experimental, and so you get a sight of the future there. Things like glass cockpits, things like composite aircraft as opposed to built out of aluminum, or rag and tube as we call it, the fabric covered aircraft. all of these technologies started with experimental aircraft, were proofed by home builders that started using them, and then were adopted into the commercial fleet.
When I started flying, the typical cockpit, typical instrument panel in an aircraft was not that much different from what Charles Lindbergh used when he crossed the Atlantic. I mean, the old steam gauges, as we used to call them. And the progress, the difference, just in the last generation of aircraft is enormous, because I'm not sure, I think it's the rule changes. The FAA has seen the light, and they have allowed technology to enter the cockpit.
The average age of a general aviation aircraft today is about 45 years old. Obviously, the technologies have changed a great deal. Over time, aircraft get retrofitted with newer technology, newer instruments, newer gauges, and so on. I agree with you. Give me an altimeter and a tachometer and a compass and one or two other things, and I'm set to go. But today, the technology allows for multifunction displays that bring all of the technology, all of the instrumentation, and a lot more information to you in a very easy to read format right in front of you.
I've flown many times coast to coast, from Los Angeles to New York and back. And at the time I would have given my left arm just to have an ability to see some weather out in front of me and plan around it. And now it's almost every aircraft that has some ability, whether you have an iPad with you in the cockpit, you have some ability to see pretty much everything that's around you, precipitation, cloud cover, visibility. You get just about anything that you need in an aircraft now to be totally aware of the weather, the traffic, the terrain, the navigation. You're no longer, navigating by looking at railroads
when I first learned to fly, which wasn't all that long ago on the overall scheme of things, we flew using charts in the aircraft, and we used radio beacons for distance, and you were constantly changing from one transmitter to another. And today, using GPS, and as you said, the iPad is just tremendous. The ability to see other aircraft around us, the ability to see the weather in near real time. I almost feel like I'm cheating when I fly now because it's become so easy. But that also has a very important side benefit: safety. The more information the pilot has, knowing what's going on around them in terms of weather, terrain, other aircraft, the safer our operations become. General aviation is extremely safe, and it's constantly getting safer through education, retraining, and so on, and new technologies.
That's another thing. When you think about the number of accidents that happen on the highways in our country, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people that are hurt or killed on our roads each year. Comparatively, in aviation, it's one of the safest ways to travel.
Actually, aviation is absolutely the safest form of transportation. I sometimes think the taxis at the airport are set up so they keep the statistics favorable. But general aviation, commercial aviation, two of the very safest forms of transportation out there. And something unique among pilots is when we see something, when there's an issue or an error or whatever, through the FAA, through AOPA, through Air Safety Institute, pilots are constantly training and retraining and refreshing their knowledge. I don't know of any other group that goes back and says, I made a mistake, I learned something from it, and I want to share that lesson with you.
Yeah, and you do have recurrent training.
Yep.
You do have, like every 2 years, you have to have a review, a flight review.
Correct.
And just to kind of brush up on your skills. And there are certain currency rules where you need to have so many takeoffs and landings within a certain period of time. So, you take it seriously. When you're a pilot, it's fun. It's a good way to travel. But it also is something that commands your attention.
Yeah.
And it is serious.
Something you just brought up, and I'd like to talk about, is travel. You talked in the beginning about what we go through when we fly commercial. Go through TSA and hurry up and wait, and then find out how long the flight is delayed, and then get shoehorned into the seat and so on. When we travel by general aviation, we set our own schedule. We decide when we want to leave. We may have to go through a gate, through security at the airport, but we don't have the TSA factor in there. We set our own schedule. We also set our own route. Now, for example, if I'm flying south from Rochester, where I'm based, I'll very often decide to veer a little bit to the east, so I get to fly over the Letchworth Gorge, because it's just an absolutely beautiful sight. And when we're traveling by air, we can select the altitude we want to fly at and the route, so that we capture the most beauty along the way.
Yeah, and when you get into aviation to a point where you're flying a moderately capable aircraft in terms of speed and seating capability, in my aircraft, I find that for most flights, I can match or beat an airliner when it comes to not speed, but overall time for a trip. When you factor in a trip to the airport, a wait in the line, then a wait because you have to get there an hour ahead of time, and then very few flights are direct flights these days. So you change planes in a different airport, which means another wait of an hour or two. All things considered, you don't have any of those things. Maybe a fuel stop if it's a distance, but overall, you're going direct, and you're going maybe to a small airport closer to your destination.
And I just like to think that there's a lot less aggravation. You're not
it's a fun thing.
You're not dealing with the crowds.
Right.
You're working your schedule, not theirs. And you can stop and get a meal when you want to. You can bring your own bag of peanuts for use in the flight. There's just a lot of flexibility as to what you can do.
Well, and I've always considered the actual flight, the getting there is half the fun.
Yeah.
So, and that's like the opposite when it comes to the airline travel.
In general aviation, it's usually more than half the fun.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, it's a practical way to get from point A to point B. If you're a family of four, most aircraft that are even moderately capable today are four-seaters. And you can get a typical, well, for instance, from here to Atlanta, Georgia is, I believe, maybe 600 nautical miles or 600.
Somewhere in that area, perhaps.
And, in an aircraft that goes, 150 miles per hour, that's going to take you, you're capable of doing that on your own in an easy day's travel.
It's going to be about a 4-hour flight, but as you say, if you go to the airport and you're there 90 minutes early and it's a 2-hour flight, you've just about made the same thing, not to mention waiting for your bags at the other end.
And so it's overall, it's an interesting hobby if you just want to get into an airplane and poke holes in the sky and kind of do a little sightseeing.
Can I talk about that for a minute?
Sure, yeah.
There's a lot of different ways to get involved in aviation, whether you want to do it for a hobby purpose or whether you want to do it professionally. Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, we're working with groups locally to help them form flying clubs. Many people may recognize that an airplane is not an inexpensive asset. If you can share some of the costs with other people, flying clubs are a great way to do that, so that you spread the cost around. And still, most people don't fly 40 hours a week, so sharing it with 4, 5, 6, 10 other people, there's plenty of time for everyone to get involved in it. Bringing kids into aviation is very important right now, developing their interest and continuing it through the STEM process, science, technology, engineering, and math. It's all important. I work with groups where we take kids up for their first flights, and when you see that smile, it usually wraps around the back of their neck. When the wheels first come off of the ground, it's fantastic to see. We're also working with flight schools to try and improve the throughput, make things better. A lot of things has changed in the way that people learn and the way we teach today. So that's a great way. And one last program I just want to mention briefly. If you happen to have been a pilot at one point, if you're a pilot once, you're always a pilot, you're just not current, as you mentioned. We run a program called Rusty Pilots for people who have gotten out of flying, might want to get back in. It's a opportunity to brush up and come back into the world of aviation. And I just have a lot of fun with that class because I get to see people reconnecting with their love. They might have gotten out of aviation, often for financial reasons or whatever, and this gives them an opportunity to get back in.
Well, we only have a minute left, a little less than a minute. For people who are interested, having listened to our conversation here and want more information, how do you suggest they follow up? What information can they find?
You can go to the AOPA website, of course, aopa.org. On there, there's a tab called You Can Fly, which talks about different ways that you can get involved in aviation. There's also a note on there about ambassadors, and you'll see my smiling face with one of the pictures, and it has contact information, how you can get a hold of me in the Western New York area. I'd be delighted to talk to anybody that wants to follow up on it.
Okay, well, very good. We're out of time for this big picture, but I think it's been an interesting discussion. I think if you have any interest in aviation whatsoever, you should follow up with the AOPA and get in touch with Norm and maybe get a little start in that direction. Thanks so much for watching The Big Picture, and thanks for watching WBBZ-TV. We'll see you next time.